We can go ahead and get started. So first, I want to thank everyone for spending some of their Thursday night with us, students as well as the panelists and our moderator, who are all busy people, and we really appreciate them taking some time out of their schedules to help us talk through some of these issues that have been going on in America with policing issues. First, I just want to give a little quick intro to FedSoc to those of you who are watching who may not be members. We're a group of conservatives and libertarians who are interested in the current state of the legal order. FedSoc is founded on the principles that the state exists to preserve freedom, that the separation of governmental powers is central to our Constitution, that it is emphatically the province and duty of the judiciary to say what the law is and not what it should be. FedSoc seeks both to promote an awareness of these principles and to further their application through its activities. And if you're interested in joining FedSoc, there will be info in the chat box for Henry Humphreys, who is our FedSoc membership director, and he'll be able to hook you up with that. Without further ado, I'll go ahead and introduce Professor Kovarsky. So Lee Kovarsky is the Brian Smith Chair in Law at UT Law School, and is also the co-director of the Capital Punishment Clinic. His teaching and writing focus on civil and criminal procedure, criminal justice, federal jurisdiction, and conflicts of law. He's been published in the California Law Review, the Cornell Law Review, and the Duke Law Journal, as well as many others. He was elected to the American Law Institute in 2020. Lee's argued before the U.S. Supreme Court and frequently drafts and contributes to amicus briefing before the U.S. Supreme Court and other appellate courts. He holds a JD from the University of Virginia School of Law and clerked for Judge Jerry Smith on the Fifth Circuit. So Lee, thanks a lot for taking part in moderating tonight, and kick it over to you.
Hi, I don't know if everybody remembers in the before times when that gentleman was giving an interview on TV as an expert in Korea, and then his daughter waltzed in a bumblebee costume. And I feel like that's all of us now. So if I can get through this without my daughters barging in, I'll consider it a victory. So I want to thank both of our panelists for being here tonight. We're going to ask each of them to deliver their remarks. And then I will ask a couple of questions, and then we will turn it over to the group for their questions. And I think first, let's have Josh. Josh Hammer is an opinion editor of Newsweek, a research fellow with the Edmund Burke Foundation, of counsel at First Liberty Institute, and a syndicated columnist. He is a frequent pundit, an essayist on political, legal, and cultural issues, and a constitutional attorney by training. His work has appeared in the LA Times, the New York Post, the National Review, First Things, the Spectator, and the Daily Wire, among many others. Josh holds a JD from the University of Chicago School of Law, is a former John Marshall Fellow at the Claremont Institute, and is a former clerk for U.S. Senator Mike Lee. Josh also clerked for Judge Jim Ho on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, and spent some time as an associate at Kirkland & Ellis in the Houston office. Take it away, Josh.
Thank you, Professor Kovarsky. Thank you, Jordan. Thank you, UT FedSoc chapter. So just a quick note of thanks. Actually, well, I'll start with an apology, then I'll continue to two quick notes of thanks, then issue a caveat, then launch into substance. An apology, I am not dressed particularly formal because I'm here somewhere in the middle of God's country, Colorado. I'm in a cabin, as you can see, and I'm just delighted to be able to join you, but I apologize for the less than business casual attire. I neglected to pack appropriately for this little mountain getaway. On to the note of thanks. I had a really, last year was my first year doing the kind of Federalist Society speaking circuit, and my trip to Austin, I spoke to both the Austin Lawyers chapter and did a colorful debate, I guess you might say, on the topic of stare decisis with Professor Steve Vladeck at the law school. It was an extraordinarily well-attended event, and I was really kind of looking forward to coming back to Austin in person. Perhaps, that may or may not still happen in the spring, but I really enjoyed my trip there last year. So I'm not sure that Professor Vladeck had the same perception of that particular event, but I certainly enjoyed it. So it was a lot of fun. And thanks to Mark for joining. When I was I can't remember, maybe like a 1L or a 2L at Chicago. I mean, I'm a fairly recent graduate. I graduated in 2016. But I remember when Marc came to speak when I was a student there, and I can't remember what he talked about, Marc, but it was a really engaging conversation. I'm a huge fan of TPPFs in general. In my role as Newsweek opinion editor, the timing of this is quite funny. I'm publishing an op-ed tomorrow morning by two TPPF scholars. So it's just kind of like a worlds colliding situation, to kind of borrow from George Costanza and Seinfeld, if I can make kind of one kind of cultural aside there. So anyway, so it's really great to be doing this. On to the final caveat, and then we'll kind of get into the substance. The only quick caveat I want to make here, I'm really happy to be able to kind of give this particular side of the conversation, but I just want to emphasize, I am fully candid and aware that I am kind of a generalist by background. This particular area that we're discussing is not my specific area of. Just by way of example, I've published 3 articles this week. One was an essay on Israel and international law. One was a column on like philosophical Burkeanism, and one was a column today on regulating big tech. And then I had a FedSoc event yesterday with UPenn on originalist jurisprudence. So I'm all over the map. So I'm really happy to be giving kind of the, for lack of a better term, more kind of hardline Tom Cotton-esque side of the criminal justice law enforcement perspective. It is a topic that I strongly agree with, and that I talk about frequently in private, if less so perhaps in public. But anyway, just kind of wanted to get that caveat out there. Okay, so let's kind of begin here and finally get into the substance. When I think about law enforcement, policing, the rule of law, the solemnity of the rule of law, the moral primacy of the rule of law, I have to think about first principles of all first principles. I have to think about why governments are instituted among men and women, obviously, in the first place. And, if you're a student of American history, if you're a fan of this wonderful country of ours, you don't actually have to go very far to find the answer to that question. In fact, Jefferson wrote it quite emphatically in the Declaration of Independence. He says, and I'm not reading here, so don't criticize me too much if I don't get it quite verbatim. But he says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, et cetera. And governments are formed to protect the natural rights that are enumerated right there, the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And it ultimately depends upon the consent of the governed, of course. But governments are instituted to essentially take us out of the Hobbesian reality. My old political science professor back in college at Duke University, Mike Munger, kind of would wax poetic about the Leviathan, the Hobbesian state of all against all. And really, I certainly am not of the belief that America is a simple byproduct of European Enlightenment, Scottish Enlightenment philosophy. It was certainly imbued by that. I think America is better understood as kind of a philosophical hodgepodge of a lot of traditions, very much including kind of the Judeo-Christian tradition, even going back, of course, to Greco-Roman thought. But it was obviously heavily influenced by Enlightenment thought, and Scottish Enlightenment thought in particular. And this notion that governments were instituted to take us out of the literal, not just proverbial, but literal dark ages, was something that really resonated, and I think was ubiquitously understood by the largely, white male Protestant men, if we can kind of talk in like the PC speak of the day, who created this wonderful charter of ours back, Declaration of 1776, and ultimately the Constitution of 1787. And it really, I think when we talk about this substance of particular law enforcement, of policing, of whether we have, over incarceration, under incarceration, state prisons, federal prisons, whether we're locking up too many people, too few people, whether policing tactics are justified, no-knock warrants, all of this, all of these, systemic racism, policing, all of this kind of, I think, has to be viewed through the lens, through the prism of the first principle of all first principles, which is that we institute governments for public safety, to protect us and to secure our rights against the state of anarchic savagery from which we quite literally came. So, I'm happy that we're kind of having this conversation now, obviously, because we obviously have seen a lot of exactly that. We've seen a lot of kind of retrograde anarchic savagery, really. I mean, is really how I would phrase it over the last X number of months since, the tragic death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, obviously in late May. And, in any number of the media hits that I've done since then, I kind of just reiterate that point, which is just the mayhem and the madness that we see in the streets, that we see in the urban corridors, the indiscriminate arson, the robbing and the looting of people who have invested their lives, their fortunes. They dedicate their entire careers building up capital to build up these small businesses that have just been destroyed. It really does kind of bring me back from an observer perspective to, and it's kind of a visceral reminder of the kind of Hobbesian state of nature of that terrible Leviathan that we instituted governments to get over. So, again, that's kind of speaking at a 35,000 foot altitude level, just kind of like a little bit of a philosophical point of view here. But I do think, given that kind of normative, substantive prioritization, that hierarchy, and the solemnity of the rule of law, and a genuine respect, and I would say admiration for the men and women of law enforcement who have to go out and actually protect us and actually secure these rights and and they are the people who, of course, were standing between us and the Hobbesian state of savagery from which we came. That I think obviously should view a lot of how we view a lot of these specific issues. So it's kind of become cliche, I think, in American media, certainly in all of left-leaning discourse, very much including centrist-leaning discourse, and unfortunately, to my mind, a lot of right-leaning discourse to talk about America's horrific and systemic over-incarceration problem in particular. I think that's kind of like the one issue, perhaps above all else, in the field of kind of policing, law enforcement, that's really gotten bandied about a lot over the past few years, obviously. Obviously, Marc's think tank was very far ahead of itself with the Right on Crime initiative, especially under Governor Perry, if I'm not mistaken, very much kind of laid the foundation, of course, for the First Step Act that was signed into law by a overwhelming bipartisan fashion in December 2018, if I recall. I think it was like 88-12 was the final Senate vote or something along those lines. So there's really been like a robust debate within a kind of intra-right discourse for a lot of years as to whether we have an over and under incarceration problem. I guess, in my perspective, I think it's possible that the combined effects of the Reagan, Bush 41, and Clinton presidencies possibly overcompensated. Obviously, there was a lot of crime in the 1960s and 1970s, and we kind of had a bipartisan commitment to tough on crime initiatives, really kind of originating with the Reagan administration that I think quite successfully brought us by the early 2010s to a stunning decades-long year low in the violent crime rate. New York City, of course, being the best example of this. When Rudy Giuliani was mayor in the mid to late 1990s, by the time that he was done, and Mike Bloomberg, largely continued that line. By the time that those two mayors were done, New York City was just a totally different animal from a violent. And I'm a New York native. I have talked to many people who can describe in quite visceral detail what New York City was by the time Giuliani and Bloomberg was finished, prior to or compared to what it was under Mayor Dinkins before him. So there really was a strong bipartisan push for tough on crime initiatives, and around that time, around 2010s, kind of after maybe 20-25 years, this bipartisan commitment, I think there was a very strong possibility that maybe that mass decarceration would be too strong of a word, but maybe a robust effort to kind of decriminalize more frequently, decarcerate at least on the margins, would make sense. And at the time, actually, my 1L law school summer, I actually was a Senate Judiciary law clerk for Senator Mike Lee. So this was the summer of 2014, and Mike Lee, he was a huge proponent, a co-sponsor, if I'm not mistaken, of the First Step Act. This has always been a huge issue for him. And it really wasn't that long. It was only 6 years ago when I was a law clerk for Senator Lee. And at that time, I thought that the data kind of still made sense here, still largely supported that. I guess I'm less certain now, 6 years later, than I was only 6 years ago. And I was looking, from 2014 to 2016, I think going up to 2017, 2018, but I can't quite recall. Violent crime started to increase in America for the first time since this kind of bipartisan Reagan-led spree began. At the same time, I think it was also in 2016 or 2017. Again, I don't have all the statistics memorized off the top of my head. America's total prison population was the lowest in terms of total human beings incarcerated. The federal and state level combined was the lowest that it had been since the Bill Clinton presidency, since around 93 or 94. So if you look at that and you look at the fact that the prison population has dramatically plummeted, actually, I think a lot of the efforts of reformers of decarceration types have been by and large successful. If you combine that with the notion that violent crime for the first time started to escalate, it might be time to, I think, kind of pause and reconsider the general trajectory of current events. And then obviously you can fast forward a little bit to what has happened this year. And, I don't even know like where to start, obviously, with what has happened this year. The statistics are genuinely harrowing. They are positively unnerving. I mean, in New York City, shootings up 130%, Minneapolis, Pittsburgh, Chicago. You can go city by city and shootings are up, police morale is down, police recruitment is down. I recall a New York Post headline from, it was either this past June or past July, NYPD retirement applications shot up 400% in like a month-over-month basis. They had to like deny, if I recall, NYPD retirement applications because it was becoming a genuine public safety issue. But if we could talk about just a little, again, get a little bit more into the nitty gritty here, talk a little bit about criminology and penology. And again, I just want to reiterate that caveat that this is not my area of expertise. I'm a little bit over my head when I kind of get into the true doctrine here, but to the extent I understand it, there were four real penological goals, right? There is incapacitation, rehabilitation, deterrence, and retribution. I guess one of my number one bones to pick, and I would love to hear kind of Marc's thoughts on this, with the more kind of libertarian leaning lane, classical liberal leaning lane, criminal justice reform. I don't want to choose labels for my most esteemed interlocutor. I'll let him describe himself. But I think folks on kind of that side of these particular debates, they tend to focus a lot on rehabilitation, and I actually agree with that, especially for kind of the boogeyman of the so-called low-level drug offender, which we hear about in the discourse all the time. But if you look at the prison population, only 14%, like between 14 and 15% of those in state prisons are there for drug offenses. And state prisons, if I'm not mistaken, are about 88% of the total prison population. There's way more state offenders, of course, than those in federal prison. In fact, and if you're focusing strictly on state prison, I think it's like 65 to 70% of those who are in state prison are there for serious offenses: murder, rape, sexual assault, robbery, burglary, assault against law enforcement. I don't have all the memorized, but there were 6 high-profile, very violent offenses that constitute roughly 65 to 70% of those incarcerated at the state level. So I certainly agree that putting these so-called low-level drug offenders in prison is probably not the best way to rehabilitate someone who has only committed kind of a petty drug theft crime. And that is probably, I think, just kind of speculating, I think my largest point of overlap with my friends on the more reform-oriented side of this, which is, I think when it comes to policing overall, less is probably actually more. I published a very heterodox op-ed at Newsweek back in June from Paul Robinson, who's a professor at the University of Pennsylvania School of Law. And Paul's kind of provocative title was, he said, why police should actually support the defund the police movement. And obviously, he's not talking about defunding police in toto. I guess Professor Kovarsky might disagree with me, but I personally think that is just not an intellectually sustainable position. I understand some people might disagree with that. I don't understand it. But the point of this op-ed that Professor Robinson wrote was that mission creep is a huge problem for policing, and that by having police do all sorts of things, child custody, school discipline, traffic stops, all sorts of things like that, where people have overwhelmingly, oftentimes, negative interactions with policing, we inculcate this kind of negative mentality from people at a fairly young age with respect to their relationship with law enforcement. So I guess my strongest area of overlap with either left-leaning, centrist, libertarian, whatever you want to say, is I do think that probably less is more when it comes to policing, and I would generally support a general realignment of policing resources, of how they're allocated. They really should be sticking to what they are actually trained for, which of course is investigation, going to crime scenes, dealing with violent altercations, things of that nature. Everything else is not only is it mission creep, but I think it's actually deleterious and harmful to policing as an institution. I'm not entirely sure how long I'm supposed to take. So then I got just one final point, then I'll kind of pass over, and then we'll look forward, of course, to a robust Q&A. But just kind of talk about the penological goal of incapacitation for a bit, because this is a big point, I think, for me. And to the extent I understand, Senator Tom Cotton was, he was kind of the leading senatorial opponent of the First Step Act. He quite famously and provocatively has maintained that we have actually an under-incarceration problem in America, which from a strictly numerical standpoint, I actually agree with. I think roughly 19% of property crimes in America ultimately lead to an arrest, 19. 47% of violent crimes lead to an arrest. So from a sheer numerical perspective, we almost assuredly do have an under-incarceration problem just based on those two data points alone. Again, I'm not saying that we should be locking up every petty drug offender, but just based on the number of property crimes and violent crimes that don't lead to arrest, let alone prosecution or incarceration. It seems to me that is fairly self-evident. But again, on the incapacitation point, I was looking at the Bureau of Justice statistics from the DOJ for the year 2019. 83% of those in state prison reoffend within 9 years of release. And what's remarkable is I think it's 77% of those who are arrested at the state level for drug offenses actually recidivate for non-drug crimes. And it's something like 35 to 40% actually commit then a violent crime of those who are initially in for drug offenses. And then another data point that Mark and our mutual friend Rafael Manguel I think has made, and I think it resonates quite deeply with me. Rafael of the Manhattan Institute has noted that I don't remember the exact time frame, but the past 3, 4, 5, however many years, looking specifically at Chicago, and I went to law school in Chicago. I'm very familiar with the trials and tribulations of that. On the one hand, wonderful, on the one hand, deeply flawed city. The median murderer in Chicago has 12 prior arrests. 12. It's an astonishing number. And I worry that my friends on the other side of this debate don't pay enough attention to the recidivism, genuine concerns of recidivism, to the actual benefits of incapacitation for the intrinsic stake of incapacitating people who, frankly, I think have kind of morally lost their freedom, or have morally lost their ability to engage in polite society. So I'm kind of rambling at this point. I don't entirely know how long I'm supposed to be taking, but just for the sake of kind of stop me at some point, I guess I'll stop myself here.
I think you're great, and we're supposed to be doing about 10 to 15 minutes for each of you guys, so I think you're good. I will now introduce Mr. Marc Levin, who is the Chief of Policy and Innovation for the Right on Crime Initiative at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, which is a major national clearinghouse for conservative criminal justice reform. In 2014, Marc was named one of the Politico 50 in the magazine's annual list of thinkers, doers, and dreamers who really matter in this age of gridlock and dysfunction. He's testified on criminal justice policy before Congress. He's testified before legislatures in numerous other states. His work has been featured in publications such as the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, the Texas Review of Law and Politics, the Dallas Morning News, the Houston Chronicle, and Reason Magazine, among many others. He received his JD from the University of Texas at Austin, yay, and served as a law clerk to Judge Will Garwood on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, and has been a staff attorney at the Texas Supreme Court. So take it away, Marc.
Well, thank you so much. If my speechifying is anywhere as good as Josh's rambling, we'll have a good discussion. But it's always great to be with Josh, and thanks for hosting us. Of course, the title that was given to this is "What Should Law Enforcement Do?" And in some ways, that's a tautology, because obviously they should, above all else, perhaps enforce the law. But that in turn begs the question of what the law should be, which is really something I've been struggling with for the last 15 years since I started the criminal justice program at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And, we have to ask what should be a crime, what should be civil, what conduct should create a requirement that someone be arrested, what conduct should give rise to the discretion of the officer whether to make an arrest. And of course, in discussing with the students leading up to this event, there was a lot of interest in a major debate in the last Texas legislative session regarding whether police should be able to arrest for non-jailable traffic violations like a broken taillight or a failure to signal where there's not a breach of the peace and not a threat to the officer's safety. And it ended up that the Texas House passed a bill to address that, but it wasn't acted upon in the Senate. So we'll be back next session to deal with that. But of course, there's a broader problem of overcriminalization. In Texas, there's 1,500 offenses outside the penal code. At the federal level, the General Accounting Office counted over 4,500 statutory crimes and then gave up. And then Dick Thornburg mentioned there's hundreds of thousands of regulatory crimes by federal agencies that were created by bureaucrats without any legislative approval. Now, let's be honest, it's not the 11 felonies in Texas for harvesting oysters in one way or another that's putting people behind bars, but it is a threat to liberty. And that's really kind of where we come in. I think historically there's been a divide going back to the 60s between kind of the lock them up and throw away the keys, you do the crime, you do the time type mentality. And on the other hand, people on the left who frankly would often say we can't really hold people responsible for crime because of societal causes. And that's a caricature to some degree, I want to be fair, but that did really emerge as a divide, particularly in the mid-70s, because the interesting thing was up until the mid-70s, the US incarceration rates were relatively similar to Canada and Western Europe. Now, I think Josh actually kind of said in so many words that the pendulum needed to swing, and we actually agree with that. But it swung really far. In other words, we increased incarceration rates from the mid-70s to the mid-2000s by 5 to 6 times in the United States. And it was a bipartisan endeavor. And there were problems with some of what was being done in the 60s, where people that committed serious violent crimes, they could not be sent to prison under certain laws. And then you also had kind of a culture of if it feels good, do it. And even some of the rehabilitation programs were kind of just trying to build people's self-esteem instead of some of the motivational interviewing, the cognitive behavioral therapy. One of my big points is we have more tools now. We have more effective ways of supervising people and changing criminal thinking patterns than was really done in the 60s. So we've had this divide, which I think is a false dichotomy, right? Because we ought to hold people accountable for their wrongdoing. But at the same time, we do have to acknowledge the life trajectory that people have. And so you might have someone who came from, Josh referenced inner city Chicago, who felt like they had to join a gang to protect themselves. But you also have people that are victims of domestic violence or human trafficking. You have people that are mentally ill. You have high rates of people with traumatic brain injury in the criminal justice system. And so there is a spectrum of culpability and a spectrum of reasons why people end up. And of course, for those of us on the right, we can't ignore the data in particular about the role of not having a father in the home. And, we all know the data about children whose father was incarcerated have a 6 times more likely chance of going to prison themselves. So and I referenced the issue of those who were victims of domestic violence or sex or human trafficking. And actually, we worked with Governor Abbott to do an executive action about a year ago that's going to start screening those people in prison to see some of those people. Maybe it wasn't known at the time, or maybe they didn't meet the 4 corners of a self-defense law. But through this process, they'll be reviewed, taking that into account as to whether they should be paroled. So that's the right thing to do, to say we will never back down on holding people accountable, but we're also going to look at the reasons that may have contributed to someone getting in the criminal justice system and see what we can do to prevent that to begin with, but then also kind of account for that in the system itself, consistent with public safety. So that's kind of where we come at it. And I think one of the issues that's been really emblematic is bail reform, because it's very easy to say it's certainly equal on the surface if you say there's going to be a $5,000 bail for everyone who comes into the system for burglary or drug possession, whatever the crime might be. But of course, some people will inevitably not be able to pay it and some will. I think we actually, is very interesting, in the Republican Party of Texas put a ballot, they have a number of propositions in the last primary election. And one of them was that the bail system should be based on public safety, the risk of put to public safety and the risk of not of absconding rather than how much money someone has. And it got over 90%. It was right up there with not screwing with the Alamo. So it is something that actually brings people together to in that particular area. Now, once you get into the specifics, you have to be very careful to make sure that you keep public safety foremost in mind, in addition to the fact that people are innocent until proven guilty. It's a balance. So let me just address kind of what we've done in Texas, because I think it's really indicative. So back in 2007, we faced a situation where there was a projection that we needed to build 17,000 prison beds. And Texas historically had always just built those beds. And instead, at that time, even though the legislature had plenty of money, they said, let's look at what else we could do. And we had prosecutors and judges coming up to the legislature saying they had nonviolent individuals, drug possession, low-level property crimes, and they were sending them to prison because there was no drug court. There was no treatment program. There were waiting lists of hundreds of days for mental health treatment. So we decided, the collective we, to basically put in place enhanced availability. We've increased drug courts from 35 to 121. We reduced probation caseloads. We expanded mental health treatment. And then we also dealt with the back end of the system, because people had been approved for parole but couldn't get out because they didn't have, there was a waiting list for halfway house beds, or there were waiting lists for treatment in prison. There was a condition for actually being released even after being approved for parole. So we cleared all that out. And the whole goal of that, justice reinvestment, was to avoid building all these prisons. Well, lo and behold, we've closed 10 prisons. Crimes declined 40% in Texas, more than in the nation as a whole. And so I think it's fair to say it's been pretty successful. Now, I think that, you can't take from that, obviously, that we could, we could just set an arbitrary goal and say we're going to cut incarceration 50% from here, right? Because now we're down to 121,000 people in prison now, partly due to the pandemic and not taking admissions. So a lot of things have to, you have to have a balanced approach and realize when you do something on one side of the system, like, for example, if you actually cut out the drug courts, cut out the treatment and supervision that we put in place, because obviously we're about to have a tough budget situation, you could end up with more recidivism, more people going to prison. So one of the interesting issues that Josh brought up is the very high rate of recidivism of people coming out of prison. And he's actually right about that. But there's a criminogenic effect of incarceration. In other words, people can actually come out worse than when they came in. Now, I agree that incapacitation is a central role there's a central role for incarceration and incapacitating people that would otherwise be committing serious crimes if they were not incarcerated. But what we've really looked at in Texas is the state jail population. So the largest group of people going to state jail is for possession of less than a gram of drugs. And then there's hot checks of various property crimes. Now, Harris County several years ago put in place a diversion program. And basically they offered folks for charged with less than a gram of drug possession, if you go through treatment overseen by the probation department, and based on a risk and needs assessment, whether it's going to be residential or non-residential, it was mostly non-residential, but you won't get this conviction on your record. And it was initially just for first time. It might be second time folks now at least as well. And the reason they did it as a pre-adjudication diversion was they discovered that a lot of these individuals were accumulating county jail time as they couldn't afford bail. So by the time their case was resolved, 4 or 6 months they had been in county jail, they wanted to just take the incarceration. In other words, if they went to state jail, they'd only have a couple months left to do. And then the way the system's structured, there's no supervision afterwards. So why would they do 5 years of probation at that point, which is what the alternative is. So by catching these people early, as soon as they got to jail, before they lost their job, before they may be evicted from their home because they're not paying rent and all of that. And that's a central thing, is when somebody goes to state jail for 6 months, right? They lose connection to their family. They become very hard to employ because now they're getting out of jail without a place to live, and having this felony on their record, very hard to get a job. So whatever they had going for them in terms of family connections to a church or other pro-social activities, incarceration really disrupts that. And then plus you meet a lot of people that might be a bad influence while you're locked up. So that a lot of states have actually moved away from these short periods of incarceration for nonviolent offenders. In fact, in Ohio, a few years ago through the budget, they moved that along with 2/3 of what they were spending for this lowest level group, the same types of offenses I'm talking about, moved it to the counties. And it's actually voluntary for the counties other than the 10 most populous, and most of them have opted in. So that, I think, there is this benefit to a closer to home justice system, because when you're doing reentry, for example, which is a huge focus of ours, and this is something I think everyone kind of comes together on, that you want people being able to, for example, get an occupational license. We had a system in Texas before our legislation where if we were training people to be barbers in prison, but then they couldn't cut hair when they were released. So we changed that. Now, if it's not directly related to the occupation, you can get a license. But the point being, reentry is easier to do from a facility that's close to where the person lived, where their family, where they're a church they could be connected with. And we do that, by the way. Now we restored funding for parole chaplains in Texas. So not just churches, but mosques or synagogues, whatever it might be. But if you can have those pro-social connections instead of, you know, getting back into a gang, for example, it makes a huge impact. So let me just address kind of a couple of other things, and then I'll wrap up. I think one of them is just the importance of community supervision, which obviously probation and parole have a lot more people in them than actually prisons and jails. So the other interesting fact is almost half the people who are admitted into prison are people that are revoked from probation or parole. Some of that is new offenses, either a new felony or misdemeanor. About 40% is technical violations. People miss an appointment or, you know, miss several appointments. They test positive for drugs. They leave the county without permission. They drink alcohol, mostly things you or I could do legally, but they can't do because they're on probation or parole. And so one of the things we've really tried to do through some legislation is to make sure the conditions we put on people are tailored to them individually, which gets back to some of the points I was making earlier, to their objective risk and needs assessment, which is an actuarial instrument, you know, that answers certain questions about what factors led somebody into criminal activity, what are their criminal thinking patterns, what issues need to be addressed so they hopefully don't recidivate. So, of course, there's also been advances in technology. We've seen this with the pandemic, with apps that people can use to help report to their probation officer. It can connect them with treatment. So these objective risk and needs assessments that, by the way, aren't just done initially, but to also track someone's progress. My main point here is that we know more than we did in the 60s and the 70s. We didn't have drug courts then. When Vietnam veterans came back, we didn't have veterans courts. We know that this, whether it's a continuity of the judge's involvement to both hold someone accountable and connect them to treatment, or also the improved techniques in terms of community supervision, medication-assisted treatment for opioid disorder. So we have more tools now. Now that doesn't mean that, you know, by any means that prisons and jails are an anachronism, that we're gonna get to a point where we don't need them by any means. But I think it does mean we can better identify who doesn't need to go to jail or prison, and also for people who are incarcerated, how long they need to be there, length of stay. We're certainly during the pandemic, we've seen many jurisdictions successfully identify geriatric individuals that are in a condition where they can no longer be a significant threat. The data shows under a 3% recidivism rate for elderly inmates. So I do think there's things we can kind of continue to find common ground on. I think those of us who really believe that there is a role for accountability. Obviously, the last thing we want to do is kind of just say that we're going to kind of go back to a 60s attitude of if it feels good, do it. We think that, getting back to the topic, that the law is important. It's important to enforce the law, but it's also important to get results. And I think that comes from kind of taking a tailored approach to responding to criminal activity and distinguishing who needs to be incapacitated from who can be rehabilitated. So I look forward to your questions and comments, and I really appreciated Josh's remarks as well.
I will just stand in for everybody and say thank you so much. So we've got about 20 minutes, and I think what I'm going to do is ask for folks to post questions in the Q&A function, and I will mix questions that I see in the Q&A function in with questions that I ask for each of the panelists. I'm going to try to ask questions to the panelists that give them each an opportunity to answer. So my first question to both of you, and it doesn't matter who goes first, is obviously along two major axes, this year has produced events that might force us to change the way we think about our criminal justice practices in the country. So my question is, how, if at all, have the anti-policing protests and the pandemic changed your views about either incarceration or policing? And if they've hardened your pre-existing views, like what would you say to somebody who, like, what do you think an antagonist would say? Why would they say that that's just confirmation bias talking? That's an adult way of saying when my kids are fighting, I say, "What would your sister say?"
Great questions. Questions in the plural, I think, but really provocative stuff. Obviously, I'm happy to jump in first. Yeah, no, look, I mean, I obviously kind of teased this out in my introductory remarks. I think what's happened this year has made me more passionate, certainly, about these issues. You know, like I've said, this is not necessarily my bread and butter, not my wheelhouse, but I query whether I would even be on this panel talking if the events of Minneapolis and just all the mayhem this summer, I don't know if I would have been animated enough to partake in a panel like this had that sort of nonsense, for lack of a better term, been happening all across the country in waves. I think it has a little bit more to do, for me personally, everything that's happened this year with the policing and the police activity and the police accountability and all of that element or that side of this ledger, as opposed to incarceration levels debate, rehabilitation and recidivism and all that. I did a Federalist Society debate with Jay Schweikert of the Cato Institute back in July on qualified immunity. And certainly the issue of qualified immunity, I've been thinking a lot about that. I mean, it seemed like in the weeks after the horrible death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, everyone across the entire aisle was kind of shouting unanimously, or so it seemed at least at times, to kind of eviscerate and once and for all this lawless doctrine of qualified immunity. And I'm certainly no grand defender of the purported originalist, provenance of qualified immunity. It's obviously a judge-made doctrine. It kind of dates back to a unanimous 1967 Supreme Court opinion called Pearson versus Ray, written by that great conservative icon Earl Warren. Actually, the second prong of the qualified immunity test, the so-called clearly established prong, was actually kind of, I think it was actually Earl Warren's way of trying to show a bit of humility, because that prong, as I understand it, was kind of put in there so that law enforcement basically couldn't get sued for actions that the court was essentially kind of fabricating new Fourth Amendment case law on a month-by-month basis. So it had to have some semblance in the law before you could be sued for it. In any event, I'm getting a little carried away here. I do think that everything that I've seen this year, just, like the all cops are monsters, just this horrible rhetoric that we see, and these billboards in the streets, cops are pigs. Colin Kaepernick, obviously going back a few years, says like he wore those socks at a football game with like the cops being pigs. I mean, just the rhetoric is horrible. And I really, really, really do worry about police recruitment. Again, Mark and I, our mutual friend, Rafael Mangual, his father, if I'm not mistaken, is a cop. And he takes this quite personally, and he's written about this, is what kind of mid to long-term effects will this have on whether good men and women want to choose law enforcement as their profession. So I really, really, really do worry a lot about that. And those are kind of the thoughts that I've had this year on that side of the ledger, a little bit more, I think, than the, over or under incarceration side.
Yeah, no, it certainly has been a chaotic year to date. And I think Josh and I both share a tremendous admiration for the work that police officers and other law enforcement do and the risks that they take. I think going back to the idea of what should law enforcement do, that we really want to have as many tools in the toolbox as we can. And back in 2007, Josh, you mentioned Governor Perry earlier. We worked with him on the cite and summons law, which was a bill that allows officers in certain instances, if someone doesn't have an outstanding warrant or there aren't other issues, to issue a citation and summons for certain Class A and B misdemeanors, including small amounts of marijuana. the problem for a number of years was that they needed actually a pre-printed citation that says a court date, and the only way to get that is from the prosecutor. Well, going back, and after 2007 law passed, there was a DA in Williamson County named John Bradley. He told the Texas lawyer, "I'm never going to do this," you know. And the idea of the bill was to really give that to the police. And so not to have the prosecutor be able to totally prevent that from occurring. So, of course, since the pandemic started, a few additional counties in Texas have signed on to this. And again, it's ultimately the officer making the judgment at the scene based on whether, you know, he thinks the person is a good bet to show up, and whether, you know, that there's whether there's another reason or not to bring them to jail. You know, it's one of the interesting things is in the last legislative session, one of the most conservative state senators, Paul Betancourt from Houston, sponsored a bill that did pass the Senate, but not the House, to add criminal trespass as one of those offenses to the cite and summons law. And again, it's totally within the discretion of the officer. Of course, we know, I mean, it's always been the case. Whenever an officer makes an arrest, he takes a risk. And now, of course, obviously with the pandemic, there's a risk both to the officer and the person being arrested, and then to subsequently in the jail. You know, I've met so many sheriffs over the years who have really people with mental illness in their jails are a huge concern for them due to the additional cost and the risk that they pose. Some of them, you know, when you're severely mentally ill, following instructions is not always something that you're able to do. And the whole kind of notion of order in the jail is kind of built around that. So I think that that's a good example of some of the kind of smart things we can do. I forgot to mention earlier when I was talking about the diversion of people for state jail felonies, which is less than a gram of hard drugs. So when Harris County, after they implemented this several years ago, they've tracked it and they compared people of a similar risk profile who went to state jail versus those that took this pre-adjudication diversion. And there's about 2 to 3 times lower recidivism rate over several years that those who participated in the diversion. So, I mean, what we've really tried to emphasize is we're standing by. I'm going to talk about something from 2007, right? Where these are all policies we supported going back many years. So we did not basically decide to turn over a new leaf to change our beliefs based on things that occur in the news. So obviously I think some of those, as I mentioned with the COVID-19, it has increased the urgency of what we can do in terms of supervising people remotely, in terms of cite and summons and so forth. But I think that there was already momentum in that direction.
So I'm going to pick up with John Daniel Hagan's question here. I'm going to tie it into a question that I have. I think there's a misconception that people, for lack of a better term, on the left side of this debate ground their arguments primarily in a philosophy of the absence of self-determination and free will. But I think actually they're very heavily steeped in the data. And Josh, you might be surprised at my view that I think most of the people who are serious about the data agree with you on the following point. We can't have a serious conversation about over-incarceration without talking about people that committed violent offenses. Because part of the reason, even though there are a ton of drug arrests, those people don't spend a lot of time in prison. So what we're really talking about when we're talking about the number of prisoner days are people that are in prison and jail for a very long time because they've committed a violent offense. However, when I listen to the two of you talk, it sounds like you are both willing to concede that on the incarceration side, that Josh, like maybe we're doing a little bit too much over incarceration of nonviolent offenses, and Mark, on the policing side, maybe we're giving police too much authority to escalate for nonviolent activity that they encounter on the street. Is that a fair read? And I think that's a good segue into John Daniel Hagan's question, which is broken windows policing like the type that New York City pursued in the 90s, which of course is policing around these low-level offenses, something that conservatives should embrace or reject moving forward?
So look, I mean, no two issues are going to be morally analogous to one another, right? I realize that's kind of a cop-out caveat at the at the start, but I think it's an important caveat nonetheless. I mean, the notion of a nonviolent offense, I think a lot of people can take that in any number of different directions, of course. I mean, look, when I was a Fifth Circuit clerk for Judge Jim Ho, I was based in Dallas. I worked on a child pornography case, and it was one of the most horrific cases I ever worked on as a clerk. I mean, is child pornography a quote unquote violent offense? I mean, I don't know, but I certainly know that I think that person should be incarcerated, who was engaged in that activity. Similarly, look, I mean, like even within the confines of narcotics itself, I mean, like certainly we should be capable as a society of distinguishing, between kind of the petty marijuana purchaser on the street versus, someone kind of working with, Hezbollah and the drug cartels down in Colombia on like a transcontinental, like cocaine, et cetera, trafficking ring. I mean, surely these two things are not analogous to one another. Query, whether we might call one or the other quote unquote violent or not. So look, from a philosophical perspective, I mean, again, I mentioned this in my remarks. The term broken windows policing, at least in my mind, I associated so closely with the Rudy Giuliani mayoral administration in New York City. I think Rudy Giuliani's policies worked. I mean, I just from a sheer data-driven standpoint. So I guess if we're talking about whether or not they should be replicated in the year 2020, look, policing, obviously, by definition, everyone tuning into this discussion knows is obviously not a federal issue. There are various ways the federal government can get involved with, like South Dakota versus Dole style kind of purse strings and federal grants and DOJ, but it really obviously is quintessentially a local issue, as it should be, because no local population is identical to one another. So I think when you're facing a situation like Rudy Giuliani did when he came in, replacing Mayor Dinkins in New York City, I think his approach worked. Am I going to say that approach is necessarily the ideal approach, like the paradigm that should be imitated in every particular instance over and over again? I think that would be a bit of a stretch. But Professor Kovarsky, to answer your question more directly, look, it is obviously not my contention that every low-level possessor of narcotics should go to prison. But I don't think that's happening. I don't think that's a reality on the ground today either. To the extent that there was like a jurisdiction that is kind of rogue or a bit of an outlier where that is happening on a large scale, without knowing more, kind of as a general rule, I would be likely to condemn such practices. But I don't think that's actually happening on like a grand scale in any particular area.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I think that one of the things is true that, obviously in some states like Oregon, for example, there's very few people sent to prison for drug possession to begin with. Texas, it was about 5 years ago, about 20,000. I think it fell to about 15,000 a year before the pandemic, and it's probably significantly lower now. But it's still a fair number of people. But beyond that, there's people, a lot of the folks who commit property crimes. It's either to feed an addiction or, to get the money to pay for drugs, or a mental health problem. So when you combine people that either have substance abuse disorder or significant mental illness as a percentage of people who are going to prison, it's over half. So again, that's not to say none of those people should go to prison, but it is to say that there are opportunities to, whether it's through a veterans court or a drug court, to really potentially have a better outcome, or residential treatment, or in fact, if they are incarcerated, to make sure they get the interventions there that will change their trajectory. I think the other thing, of course, with violent offenses, those are quite a spectrum. You do have barroom fights, you have misdemeanor assaults, so there's a variety of circumstances there. But I think there is certainly, when you start talking about homicide, rape, there are there's no dispute that there in responding to those very serious offenses. And also, again, looking at somebody's risk level, even if it's not at that level, but looking at their prior offenses and their risk analysis that they need to be incapacitated in some instances for a significant period of time. So I think we're in agreement there. Now, the good news is on the other end of it is we do have through the assessments that the parole boards do, as well as now looking, of course, I mentioned earlier at the geriatric population, we can identify some individuals who, from at least an incapacitation standpoint, have served enough or more than enough and can be released with appropriate supervision.
So Mark, you referred several times to people with mental health issues. And the next question is from William Matala. And he has a question about the defunding police movement, which I'll stipulate is a horrible tagline. I do think there's a lot of energy behind shrinking the footprint of the police, which can also mean a lot of different things. It can mean demilitarizing. It can mean authorizing them to effectuate fewer arrests. It could be reducing their authority to escalate. But one of the most common questions you hear is the one William's asking, which is, well, should police be doing mental health intervention at the levels that society seems to want them to do? Mark, why don't you take a crack at that? And then Josh, if you want to talk about it, you're welcome to as well.
Sure. Well, I mean, obviously, we're strongly opposed to defunding the police. And it is a contrast to the incarceration argument because the U.S. has fewer police per capita than Spain, France, Mexico. But we have, in half times as many people incarcerated as Germany. Now, I'm not going to say, there's reasons why we should be somewhat different. But so there are, it's a very different reality when you look at policing versus incarceration. But in terms of the mental health issue you specifically asked about, we've written a lot about co-responding, where you have both an officer and a clinician. In some instances where there's not a clinician available, their officer is able to connect with them, as well as case management through a tablet. One of the big questions is 911 dispatch. What decision is made on who to send? And it's complicated because you can't just say that if it's not a alleged crime that therefore an officer doesn't need to go. Because, for example, if somebody's about to jump off a bridge, well, if you just send a clinician and they aren't able to talk them out of it, then who's going to actually restrain them when a need for that arises? So I think that the co-responding model in many instances does make a great deal of sense. And also, of course, most major departments have long done the crisis intervention teams where they have special training in mental illness. So, I think that that's something that should not be seen. I don't think it is seen as in any way defunding the police, but rather adding more resources. And my colleague, Randy Peterson, has written a number of papers on police training, which are really outstanding that I would commend that you take a look at it. I'm not an expert on police training, but he certainly is. And they're on our website at texaspolicy.com. But I am very, I have worked a lot on mental illness in the criminal justice system. And I do think that the co-responding model is really quite promising.
So I'm going to try to get to both questions left in the queue right now. And just for some continuity, because I think, Mark, you're going to get the question about the Texas legislature. I'm going to ask Josh to answer Brad Rednow's question. I think Brad wonders whether it makes sense to stratify our methods of incarceration such that there's different modes of incarceration for people who commit different types of offenses or for people with different types of needs. So, I think this is the triage question, and the goal that he's asked, or the goal that he's suggesting might be to send people to certain places where the goal is more rehabilitative and send people to others where the goal is more incapacitative.
Yeah, I think the answer is emphatically yes. Again, when I was clicking for Judge Ho, I toured one federal prison. The name's escaping me. It's whatever the closest prison is right outside Dallas. It's probably no more than 15, 20 miles, I think, east or southeast to the city. and it was like a rehabilitation centric federal facility. And you know, along with the various people that I was touring with, I saw some of like the activities in action that they were doing, and it was really impressed. I mean, it was quite different than, frankly, it was one of my, I think it might have been my very first time touring a federal prison, and it was really not at all what I expected it to be. If I recall, based on what I was told from the warden and the folks there, that this particular prison was a bit of an outlier in various of their methodologies and what they were doing to try and rehabilitate the prisoners, excuse me. So look, the short answer is yes. Prison by definition is a very crass tool. It is that's not to say it's not necessary. Of course it's necessary. And I think that all four of the penological goals that we mentioned earlier, incapacitation, rehabilitation, deterrence, and retribution, are morally, both from a moral and public safety standpoint, legitimate goals for public policy purposes. So prison, of course, serves a role. But prison is, of course, both over and under inclusive. It is a very crass tool. There is no such thing as, I think, one prison that is going to be ideally suited for offenders who have committed offenses ranging, again, from you know, international drug cartel, drug trafficking, to child pornography, to rape. I mean, like, no two crimes are alike by definition. And ideally, you know, obviously the public fisc and fiscal sanity and fiscal policy plays a huge role here. But I think in an ideal world, one overarching plank for a true criminal justice reform that I think would be both efficacious from a fiscal standpoint, and would be better focused for outcomes for prisoners themselves, ideally lowering criminogenic effects, recidivism, et cetera, would be this sort of kind of multifaceted, multi-tiered prison structure. But again, that's kind of just like a theory. I don't really know if that's truly gaining traction in any particular state legislative chamber. I would defer to Mark on that, but it sounds to me like a great idea in theory, to be honest with you.
Yeah, no, I mean, you'll see there are obviously different custody levels, you know, low security prisons where, of course, in Texas, there's trustees who drive an 18-wheeler across the state delivering supplies between prisons. But, you know, you have day reporting centers, work release centers. I actually was able to tour prisons in Germany several years ago. And what was really struck me about it was how much autonomy the inmates had there. So they went to work every morning building bumpers. They got paid like 15 euros a day. But, you know, no one escorted them there. They, you know, it was up to them. And if they didn't show up at 8 in the morning, they didn't get paid. And it's actually in statute that the prison should be as much as possible like the real world, in terms of, you know, you reap what you sow, basically. And, you know, they would pick out their own ingredients to make dinner, and that sort of thing. So they checked out library books themselves. So they had to make a lot of choices during the day, which, you know, I remember once I was talking to a guy who, you know, the first day he got out of prison, he said, I just was staring at the menu in the restaurant. I could not decide what to order because I had been kind of like an automaton. I hadn't had to make any decision for years. I do really think that, obviously, you know, we're not talking about making prisons luxurious or anything, but I think that having it be more where there's a personal responsibility, that you kind of your privileges, for example, I mean, how late you can stay up or what you get at the commissary, that those are tied to, you know, your behavior and your product, you know, and so forth. So I think that does make sense. Sometimes it's referred to as the parallel universe model, so that it's as much as possible like the real world with security, appropriate security, of course.
Okay, so the last question from Tanner is, what are the odds that the Texas legislature takes up the Class C misdemeanor arrest reform this session, and what would that mean for police on the ground? And that is obviously for you, Mark.
Sure. Well, I think it's really high, although I'm somewhat, there's a lot, some of you may have heard, there's a lack of clarity about, you know, how many bills each member, normally there's not a limit, but given COVID, some of the restrictions around the Capitol, whether there'll be kind of a narrow funnel, so fewer things can be considered. So we don't know that yet. But on the merits of it, I think there was such a determination in the House to get something done. I know, I think there's certainly some senators, including I was on a panel recently with a conservative state senator, Brian Hughes, who's really wants to said, that it's an important commitment for him. So, as some of you may know, you have to have 60% of the votes in the Senate and be recognized by a lieutenant governor to bring something up. That's kind of where things didn't move forward last time. So, I want to point out it is a small percentage of the total arrests in the vast majority of cases. The law in Texas is if it's not open container or speeding under 100, the officer can opt to make an arrest. But, the vast majority of the time they don't, but there are these thousands of cases, several thousand cases at least every year where they do make an arrest. And again, some of those may still be permissible under this because it's clear about if there's a breach of the peace or a threat to the officer's safety, they can make that decision. But I just think, the average Texan, the notion that you at least theoretically can be arrested for nothing but a broken taillight or failure to signal, which was the Sandra Bland case, I think it does really, it just, and we've seen this through polling, even of conservatives and Republicans, and this was part of the Republican Party platform, both last time and the platform that was adopted earlier this year, and it was also part of the Democratic Party platform, so it's a weird kind of consensus thing. So, yeah, I'm going to be pretty optimistic that that will get done.
Okay, well, we are a little past 7:30, and I was hoping to have some time to wear my lefty professor hat, but unfortunately, I don't think that is fair to our other panelists or to other people who are expecting a 7:30 end, or to my wife, who is clearly struggling to get my children to sleep. I don't know if Jordan, you want to thank the participants beyond
yes,
that?
Of course.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you all very much for taking time. Lee, thanks for taking time out of your busy family life to be here with us tonight. Josh and Mark, thanks to y'all for taking time out of your schedules to be here with us tonight, and we really appreciate it. And this event will be posted on YouTube if you want to watch it later or share with your friends. And again, just have a good night. Take care.
Thank you.